Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of the 4MS Stereo Triggered Sampler tutorial. If you missed part 1, make sure to check that out first. That's where I go over the basics of the module, the layout, and basic playback and stuff. In this video, we're going to focus mainly on sampling, recording, slicing, and SD card sort of manipulation. Alright, so let's get started. We're just going to sample a simple sound just so you get a feel for how you record something with this module. This middle section here where you see this black outline, that's everything you need to know for recording and sampling purposes. So basic overview, we have a bank button and a sample knob, and this is how you select which bank and which sample slot in that bank you want to record into. Then you have your primary record button, and this acts as both arming the recording and actually triggering the recording and stopping the recording. And finally, down here you have left and right input, so you can actually sample in stereo, which is cool. And finally, you have a gate input for the record button, so you can use another signal, a clock or something, to start recording. All right, to demonstrate recording, I'm just going to be using this little AM/FM radio, nothing special, it just has a headphone output. So I'm just going to plug in the headphone output directly into the left record input here. And right now, we're not going to be able to hear anything unless you arm recording. So to do that, you hold the record button. All right, you're going to record. It's recording right now.
587 dans une journée. J'ai parti Saint-Julie, je suis allé dans le compte.
Alright, so in order to hear what you just recorded, you just basically need to find that same slot here. So you need to find the blue with double blanks. So for example, if I hold bank and hold bank here, you can see that now they're synchronized. So they're both pointing at the same bank, which is cool. So now all I have to do is point this to sample 1 because that's where I put my recording. And now I can play back the sound. And then you can do standard manipulation. You can change the pitch, you can change the length, start position. The file itself is always going to be there. So as soon as you record it, it's in the SD card. So if you pull out the card, put it in your computer, you'll see your new recording. But the mapping of that file to a particular bank and sample, that needs to be explicitly saved. And you do that by holding the sample edit button and then tapping this play button here. All right, so we've got our original file here. So now I'm going to copy from here to here in different slots. So now I'm in slot 2. You can see it's red. And to copy it, I'm just going to hold edit and push copy. So I'm just going to repeat this procedure for the others as well. All right, now, so I'm done making copies. I'm going to go back to my left channel now, which is going to be my source for manipulation of all these samples. So since I'm pointing at the same bank, we should have the same copies we just made now in all these different slots. What I'm going to do now is isolate a different word and a different subsection in each of the different copies. So you have an edit sample button, and that is your primary sort of trigger for all these different shortcuts. And then you can see wherever there's a gold-plated thing, that means that when you hold this, you can sort of manipulate that with secondary functionality. Let's start with the length. We're going to keep this one starting at the beginning. Then I can hold this. And you can see it plays back to help you find the spot you want. So now we made the sample really short, so I'm going to increase it a little bit. All right, so that is one slice completed. So now I can go into the next slot, and this one we can pick a different start position, for example. I'm just going to make a few more slices. All right, so now we've created a few different versions. Our first one is the full sample. Second one, next one we have this slice. We have, so now you can just trigger it like you normally would. So for example, I can plug in a clock source. So another cool thing we can do with the module is resample, which means just patching the sampler into itself and recording that. The reason you'd want to do that is you can manipulate the sample as it's playing back and effectively record that manipulation. So let's arm recording like we normally would. And you can see by default monitor is on. In order to turn off monitoring, just hit any of the play buttons. All right, so in this case, I'm going to patch my right output into the left input of the record. So I hit record. You can pick different samples, change the length, and hit stop. We can just audition our sound right away. So that's the recording I just did. The other thing you can do is you can record your sounds like you normally would with an audio interface or whatever. You remove this micro SD card and put it into the included adapter. You can plug it into your computer. and load WAV files that way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sample a bunch of different instruments, and I'm going to slice those up in Ableton, load them onto the SD card, and then we'll come back here and audition the sounds we made. So let's go. All right, so I'm in Ableton Live now. I've loaded all my different samples that I've recorded. As you can hear, the guitar parts, the pocket piano, and a bunch of other stuff. Anyways, I have a ton of different noises that I'm gonna sift through real quick, and I'm just gonna fast forward through this. All right, so I finished chopping up all the samples and I've laid them out one per track just because on Ableton Live you can export individual files per track easily this way. So I've exported individual WAV files for all the slices I've made, and I've organized everything into these folders here. So in each folder I've put 10 different samples, and you can hear the individual ones here. And I've named them all starting with a color name. That means that this folder will end up in the orange bank, this one in the red bank, etc. And each one I've loaded 10 samples because you can load 10 samples per bank. All right, so I have my banks all ready to go. I'm just going to move them into the SD card now. All right, so I'm back now. I've re-plugged in the SD card, which loaded all our sounds. And if you remember, we loaded a bunch of different colors like white, red, etc. So now I can audition the sounds I just sampled. And I have different banks. And of course I have my right channel too. And I can point that to a different bank. That way I can get multiple different sounds going. So one thing I like to do is use the Tempi as my clock source. I'm going to plug in a stackable so that I can forward this gate to multiple destinations. And I can use a slightly different clock to trigger the other one. And now we can start having fun. We have 4 different 4-step sequencer channels here to play with. Start manipulating the sample at every step here. We can plug the other one into pitch, for example. We can grab the 3rd channel to control the sample of the other slot. You can reverse it. And since I have 2 independent channels here, I can actually route them through different signal paths. Right now I just have them both running directly into my audio interface. But for example, I can grab this left channel and feed it through a filter here, for example. So I can filter that guitar part. Alternatively, we can run it through a fold processor, for example. Let's see what that sounds like. And if that sound is a little too rough, we can run it through the filter to smooth it out a little bit. So I'm going to forward that through the 2040 here. And then of course we can start changing samples to pick some of the other ones we recorded. feed the fourth channel of the sequencer here into, let's experiment with something. Let's put it into the sample CV of this other one. So that's what I love about having a sampler in a modular, is that you can get these really interesting grooves that you may not normally have thought of doing if you were to explicitly be like manually slicing and positioning files in a DAW or something like that. I mean, both have pros and cons, but in this case, I love the ability to just explore and manipulate. So it's almost like half planned, half spontaneous and serendipitous, where you generally have an idea of where you're going in terms of the patch and what kinds of things you want to do. That's what I love about samplers too, is that you can configure a complicated patch. I mean, this is not necessarily a complicated patch, but a fairly elaborate patch, for example. And once you have everything set, you can just start changing the sample slots and picking different samples, and you get completely different sounds. Like, for example, I can just push the 2 bank buttons and we'll get a completely different sound. Pick different samples and just tweak slightly. And most of the times you'll get something that doesn't sound great, but from time to time you run into this chord key combination of things that you don't fully control, and it kind of catches you by surprise. And that's what I love in a modular, as opposed to more standard music making where everything is more deliberate up front, but you sort of don't leave a lot of room to be surprised. So at a high level, I really like this module. I find it's a good middle ground between easy to use and functionality. So it's not overly functionally dense to the point where it becomes hard to use, but it's not really too dumbed down. So you have all the necessities you would expect from a sampler. So I would place it somewhere in between something like a TipTop 1 and something like a Morphogene. So the Morphogene to me is more like intense granular manipulation, and more if you want like weird sound effects and stuff. And the TipTop 1 is good for just standard single shot triggering, but not a lot of room to manipulate sounds. And this is sort of a nice middle ground. And so far, I like this one the best for my personal needs. Obviously, different people have different needs from a sampler, but this is a good sort of general workhorse sampler for putting sounds in, manipulating them, getting volt per octave control, which I love. And effectively, you have 2 samplers built into one if you want to treat it as 2 separate mono signals. Which is how I like to use it. All right, hopefully this was interesting and informative. If you're new here, welcome aboard. I love synthesizers, so if you love synthesizers, consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next one.